And now we reach the conclusion. The lore and world building are done, and the groundwork must be laid for potential future works. In the final part, the explorers have finally had the sense to flee, but what unknown terror is closing the gap behind them? If you want to hear more, please click like, subscribing, clicking the bell, then all will let you know when a new episode releases. Let us know what you liked and what you want to see more of in the comments. You can even join us on Patreon. For now though, it's time to enter the Cave of Chronicles. Our recklessly used torch now revealed ahead of us the large open cavern where various ways converged, and we were glad to be leaving those morbid palimpsest sculptures almost felt even when scarcely seen behind. Another thought which the advent of the cave inspired was the possibility of losing our pursuer at this bewildering focus of large galleries. There were several of the blind albino penguins in the open space, and it seemed clear that their fear of the oncoming entity was extreme to the point of unaccountability. If at that point we dimmed our torch to the very lowest limit of travelling need, keeping it strictly in front of us, the frightened squawking motions of the huge birds in the mist might muffle our footfalls, screen our true course, and somehow set up a false lead. Amidst the churning, spiralling fog, the littered and unglistened floor of the main tunnel beyond this point, as differing from the other morbidly polished burrows, could hardly form a highly distinguishing feature, even so far as we could conjecture for those indicated special senses which made the old ones partially, though imperfectly, independent of light in emergencies. In fact, we were somewhat apprehensive lest we go astray ourselves in our haste, for we had of course decided to keep straight on towards the dead city, since the consequences of loss in those unknown foothill honeycombings would be unthinkable. The fact that we survived and emerged is sufficient proof that the thing did take a wrong gallery, whilst we providently hit on the right one. The penguins alone could not have saved us, but in conjunction with the mist they seemed to have done so. Only a benign fate kept the curling vapours thick enough at the right moment, for they were constantly shifting and threatening to vanish. Indeed, they did lift for a second just before we emerged from the nauseously resculptured tunnel into the cave, so that we actually caught one and only half glimpse of the coming entity as we cast a final, desperately fearful glance backwards before dimming the torch and mixing with the penguins in the hope of dodging pursuit. If the fate which screened us was benign, that which gave us the half glimpse was infinitely the opposite. For to that flash of semi-vision can be traced a full half of the horror which has ever since haunted us. Our exact motive in looking back again was perhaps no more than immemorial instinct of the pursued to gauge the nature and course of the pursuer. Or perhaps it was an automatic attempt to answer a subconscious question raised by one of our senses. in the midst of our flight, with all our faculties centered on the problem of escape. We were in no condition to observe and analyze details. Yet, even so, our latent brain cells must have wondered at the message brought them by our nostrils. Afterward, we realized what it was, that our retreat from the fetid slime floating on those headless obstructions and the coincident approach of the pursuing entity had not brought us the exchange of stenches which logic called for. In the neighbourhood of the prostrate things, that new and lately unexplainable fetor had been wholly dominant, but by this time it ought to have largely given place to the nameless stench associated with those others. This it had not done, for instead the newer and less bearable smell was now virtually undiluted and growing more and more poisonously insistent each second. So we glanced back simultaneously, it would appear, though no doubt the incipient motion of one prompted the imitation of the other. As we did so, we flashed both our torches full strength at the momentary thinned mist, either from sheer primitive anxiety to see all we could, or in a less primitive but equally unconscious effort to dazzle the entity before we dimmed our light and dodged among the penguins of the labyrinth centre ahead. Unhappy act! Not Orpheus himself, nor Lot's wife, paid much more dearly for a backward glance. And again came that shocking wide-range piping, "Tickly-lee, tickly-lee." Danforth was totally unstrung, and the first thing I remember of the rest of the journey was hearing him lightheadedly chant a hysterical formula in which I alone of mankind could have found anything but insane irrelevance. It reverberated in falsetto echoes among the squawks of the penguins, reverberated through the vaulting ahead, and, thank heaven, through the now empty vaultings behind. He could not have begun it at once, else we would not have been alive and blindly racing. I shudder to think of what a shade of difference in his nervous reaction might have been brought. South Station, under Washington, under Park Street, under Kendall, Central Harvard. The poor fellow was chanting the familiar stations of the Boston-Cambridge Tunnel that burrowed through our peaceful native soil thousands of miles away in New England. Yet to me, the ritual had neither irrelevance nor home feeling. It had only horror, because I knew unerringly the monstrous, nefarious analogy that had suggested it. We had expected, upon looking back, to see a terrible and incredible moving entity if the mists were thin enough, but of that entity we had formed a clear idea. What we did see, for the mists were indeed all too malignly thinned, was something altogether different and immeasurably more hideous and detestable. It was the utter objective embodiment of the fantastic novelist's being that should not be. It was its nearest comprehensible analogue in a vast onrushing subway train as one sees it from a station platform. The great black front looming colossally out of infinite subterraneous distance, constellated with strange coloured lights and filling the prodigious burrow. But we were not on a station platform. We were on the track ahead as the nightmare plastic column of fetid black iridescence oozed tightly onward through its 15-foot sinus-gathering unholy speed, and driving before it a spiral re-thickening cloud of the pallid abyss vapour. It was a terrible, indescribable thing, vaster than any subway train, a shapeless congeries of protoplasmic bubbles, faintly self-luminous, with myriads of temporary eyes forming and unforming as pustules of greenish light all over the tunnel filling front that bore down upon us, crushing the frantic penguins and slithering over the glistening floor that his kind had swept so evilly free of all litter. Then came that eldritch mocking cry, "Tickly-lee! Tickly-lee!" And at last we remembered the demonic Shoggoths, given life though, and plastic organ patterns solely by the old ones, and having no language save that which the dot groups expressed, and likewise no voice save the imitated accents of their bygone masters. Danforth and I have recollections of emerging into the great sculptured hemisphere, and of treading our back trail through the cyclopean rooms and corridors of the dead city. Yet these are purely dream fragments, involving no memory of volition, details, or physical exertion. There was something vaguely appropriate about our departure from those buried epochs, for as we wound our panting way up the 60-foot cylinder of primal masonry, we glimpsed beside us a continuous procession of heroic sculptures in the dead race's early and undecayed technique. A farewell from the old ones, written 50 million years ago. Finally, scrambling out to the top, we found ourselves on a great mound of tumbled blocks, with the curved walls of higher stonework rising westward, and the brooding peaks of the great mountains showing beyond the more crumbled structures towards the east. The sky above was a churning and opalescent mass of tenuous ice vapours, and the cold clutched at our vitals. In less than a quarter of an hour we had found the steep grades to the foothills, the probable ancient terrace by which we had descended, and could see the dark bulk of our great plain amidst the sparse ruins of the rising slope ahead. Halfway uphill toward our goal, we paused for a momentary breathing spell and turned to look again at the fantastic tangle of incredible stone shapes below us, once more outlined mystically against an unknown west. As we did so, we saw that the sky beyond had lost its morning haziness, the restless ice vapours having moved up to the zenith, where their mocking outlines seemed on the point of settling into some bizarre pattern which they feared to make quite definite or conclusive. There now lay, revealed on the ultimate white horizon behind the grotesque city, a dim elfin line of pinnacled violet, whose needle-pointed heights loomed dreamlike against the beckoning rose colour of the western sky. Up towards this shimmering rim sloped the ancient tableland, the depressed course of the bygone river traversing it as an irregular ribbon of shadow. For a second, we grasped in admiration the scene's unearthly cosmic beauty, and then vague horror began to creep into our souls. For this far violet light could be nothing else than the terrible mountains of the Forbidden Land, highest of Earth's peaks and focus of Earth's evil, harbourers of nameless horrors and Archean secrets, shunned and prayed to by those who feared to carve their meaning untrodden by any living thing of earth, but visited by the sinister lightnings and sending strange beams across the plains in the polar night. If the sculptured maps and pictures in that pre-human city had told truly, these cryptic violet mountains could not be much less than 300 miles away. Yet nonetheless sharply did their dim, elfin essence jut above that remote and snowy rim, like the serrated edge of a monstrous alien planet about to rise into unaccustomed heavens. Looking at them, I thought nervously of certain sculptured hints at what the great bygone river had washed down into the city from their accursed sloping, and wondered how much sense and how much folly had lain in the fears of those old ones who carved them so reticently. I recalled how their northerly end must come near the coast of Queen Mary Land, where even at the moment Sir Douglas Mawson's expedition was doubtless working less than 1,000 miles away, and hoped that no evil fate would give Sir Douglas and his men a glimpse of what might lie beyond the protecting coastal range. Such thoughts formed a measure of my overwrought condition at the time, and Danforth seemed to be even worse. Yet, before we had passed the great star-shaped ruin and reached our plain, our fears had become transferred to the lesser but vast enough range whose recrossing lay ahead of us. From these foothills, the black, ruin-crusted slopes reared up starkly and hideously against the east, again reminding us of those strange Asian paintings of Nicholas Roerich. And when we thought of the damnable honeycombing inside them, and of the frightful, amorphous entities that might have pushed their fetidly squirming sway even to the topmost hollow pinnacles, we could not face without panic the prospect of again sailing by those suggestive skyward cave mouths where the wind made sounds like an evil musical piping over a wide range. To make matters worse, we saw distinct traces of local mist around several of the summits, as poor Lake must have done when he made that early mistake about volcanism, and thought shiveringly of the kindred mist from which we had just escaped, of that, and of the blasphemous, horror-fostering abyss whence all such vapours came. All was well with the plane, and we clumsily hauled on our heavy flying furs. Danforth got the engine started without trouble, and we made a very smooth takeoff over the nightmare city. At a very high level, there must have been great disturbance, since the ice dust clouds of the zenith were doing all sorts of fantastic things. But at 24,000 feet, the height we needed for the pass, we found navigation quite practicable. As we drew close to the jutting peaks, the wind's strange piping again became manifest, and I could see Danforth's hands trembling at the controls. Rank amateur, though I was, I thought at the moment that I might be a better navigator than he in effecting the dangerous crossing between pinnacles. And when I made motions to change seats and take over his duties, he did not protest. I tried to keep all of my skill and self-possession about me, and stared at the sector of reddish farther sky betwixt the walls of the pass. But Danforth, released from his piloting and keyed up to a dangerous nervous pitch, could not keep quiet. I felt him turning and wriggling about as he looked back at the terrible receding city, ahead at the cave-riddled, cube-barnacled peaks, sideways at the bleak sea of snowy rampart-strewn foothills, and upward at the seething, grotesquely clouded sky. It was then, just as I was trying to steer safely through the pass, that his mad shrieking brought us close to disaster by shattering my tight hold on myself and causing me to fumble helplessly with the controls for a moment. A second afterward, my resolution triumphed and we made the crossing safely. Yet I am afraid that Danforth will never be the same again. I said that Danforth refused to tell me what final horror made him scream out so insanely, a horror which I feel sadly sure is mainly responsible for his present breakdown. We had snatches of shouted conversation above the wind's piping and the engines buzzing as we reached the safe side of the range and swooped slowly down toward the camp. But that had mostly to do with the pledges of secrecy we had made as we prepared to leave the nightmare city. All that Danforth has ever hinted is that the final horror was a mirage. It was not, he declares, anything connected with the cubes and caves of those echoing, vaporous, wormly honeycombed mountains of madness which we crossed, but a single fantastic demonic glimpse among the churning westward zenith clouds of what lay back of those other violet westward mountains, which the old ones had shunned and feared. He has, on rare occasions, whispered disjointed and irresponsible things about the black pit, the cavern rim, the proto-shoggoths, the windowless solids in the 5 dimensions, the nameless cylinders, the elder pharaohs, Yog-Sothoth, the primal white jelly, the colour out of space, the wings, the eyes in darkness, the moon ladder, the original, the external, the undying, and other bizarre conceptions. But when he is fully himself, he repudiates all this and attributes it to his curious and macabre reading of earlier years. Danforth indeed is known to be among the few who have ever dared go completely through that worm-riddled copy of the Necronomicon kept under lock and key in the college library. The higher sky as we crossed the range was surely vaporous and disturbed enough, and although I did not see the zenith, I can well imagine that its swirls of ice dust may have taken strange forms. Imagination, knowing how vividly distant scenes can sometimes be reflected, refracted, and magnified by such layers of restless cloud, might easily have supplied the rest. And of course, Danforth did not hint any of these specific horrors till after his memory had had a chance to draw on his bygone reading. he could never have seen so much in one instantaneous glance. At this time, his shrieks were confined to the repetition of a single mad word of all too obvious source. Takili-lee! Takili-lee! So ends At the Mountains of Madness. Will the warning be heeded, or will future expeditions suffer a similar fate? Let me know what you think in the comments. After this, I will be going to one release a week to see how that works. The total length of the content will be the same, but in one rather than 3 episodes, so a much longer episode, and releasing on Saturdays at 5 PM UK time. If you enjoyed the tale, it helps us if you let others know, so please click the like button and share with others that may be interested. Subscribing will let you travel with us on further adventures of the dark and terrible, with the bell notifying you as we set off. If you want to join our Eldritch Order on Discord, come visit us on Patreon. Then you can join in the discussions and even help guide the choice of stories. See the description for details of the Patreon and for a link to Canje Studios to find out about modern board games where you can create your own dark and terrible stories. Until next time, farewell. But consider, we have a strong desire to explore, despite the fact that old maps showed the unknown areas frequently warning, here there be monsters.